He was kicked out of the country club, but then bought it in cash. The valet barely looked up. "Members only," he said, already turning to another man stepping out of a silver Porsche. The black man in the gray suit stood still, holding his keys. "I have a meeting inside," he said quietly. "Name's Elijah Brooks." The valet blinked, twice. Then his eyes narrowed, scanning the man up and down. No brand labels. No Rolex. No swagger. Just a clean-cut man in his 40s, a worn leather briefcase, and shoes a little too practical for this parking lot. "Sorry, sir," the valet said, voice tightening. "You'll have to wait outside." It was subtle, but deliberate. The gate that swung wide for the Porsche clicked shut behind it. Elijah didn't argue. He just nodded and stepped aside. But across the manicured hedges and fountains of the Briar Ridge Country Club, laughter echoed. Polished, practiced, expensive. Inside, a man in a tan blazer leaned to the concierge and said, "He actually tried to walk in?" The concierge gave a rehearsed smirk. Didn't quite fit the scene. This wasn't the first time. Elijah had been mistaken for the driver, the security guy, the hired help more times than he could count. But never like this. Never after being personally invited for a business discussion. The man who invited him, Harold Winslow, was a founding board member. But Harold wasn't here today. Only his absence, and a growing knot in Elijah's stomach. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we tell true stories that remind us not just of what people endure, but of what they rise from. If you've ever felt underestimated, unseen, or turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with who you truly are, this story is for you. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to share that prove the light gets in, right where the world cracks. Elijah Brooks didn't speak a word as he turned and walked back toward his car, a 2010 Lexus with fading paint, but an engine that never failed him. He had driven 2 hours to be here. Woke up before the sun, shaved, pressed his one good blazer, tied a navy blue tie his late father once wore to church. It wasn't the rejection that stung, it was the assumption. The quiet wall people put up without saying anything at all. He sat in his car for a long minute, watching the white marble columns of the club through his windshield. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. Just disappointed. He thought, just maybe, this time would be different. Elijah Brooks had grown up on the south side of Montgomery, raised by his mother after his father died in a scaffolding accident at the steel plant. He remembered nights when they boiled water on the stove for baths, shared one can of tuna across 3 plates. But she never let him call it poverty. "You're rich in faith," she'd say, brushing his cheek. And the world don't know what to do with that. He graduated with honors from a local state college, paid his way fixing computers in the dorm basements. By 30, he'd opened a tech repair kiosk in a strip mall. By 35, he had 7 stores. And now, at 43, Elijah Brooks quietly ran a software company whose cloud security patents had recently caught the attention of 3 venture firms on the West Coast. He didn't show it, didn't flaunt. He still drove his Lexus, still lived in the same modest house where he'd raised his daughter, even after her mother walked out 5 years ago. But here's the thing no one in that country club knew. Elijah wasn't here to ask for a favor. He wasn't here to beg for access. He was here because Harold Winslow had reached out after hearing about Elijah's AI-assisted data modeling, hoping they could partner on digitizing the club's exclusive real estate investments. It wasn't charity. It was business. Elijah was bringing something to the table. And now, standing in the parking lot alone, that table felt like it had never existed. He drove away slowly, hands firm on the wheel. Not angry, just clearer than ever. What they didn't see was what he'd always had to carry. The invisible tax of being overlooked, of needing to prove, every room, every meeting, every handshake, that he belonged. Not because of loud ambition, but because quiet excellence had never been enough for some people to notice. The country club was just a building. White walls, green lawns, air that smelled like privilege. But in Elijah's memory now, it was a mirror, one that showed him not who he was, but how others still chose to see him. Back home, he kissed his daughter Maya on the forehead as she scribbled math problems at the kitchen table. "You look tired, Daddy," she said. He smiled. "Just thinking." Then he sat down and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Began sketching out something that had been forming in his mind since the drive back. Elijah didn't believe in revenge, but he did believe in reclamation. In showing up, not with rage, but with readiness. And the next time he stepped onto that club's lawn, it wouldn't be as a guest. He spent the next few months quietly. No social media posts. No phone calls to Harold. He didn't even reply to the apologetic email that came 2 days after, the one that said, "So sorry about the mix-up." The staff didn't know. Elijah knew. And he remembered. Behind the scenes, he reached out to his real estate attorney. Started asking questions. Who owned Briar Ridge outright? Was there debt? Any silent investors looking to exit? He kept everything discreet. His name stayed off the radar. He let others handle the talking, the offers, the bidding. At night, he still tucked Maya into bed, read her the same chapter of Where the Sidewalk Ends, until she knew it by heart. He wasn't chasing vengeance. He was showing her what dignity looked like when no one was watching. Meanwhile, the club remained as it always had. Exclusive, curated, filtered. But beneath the manicured image, things weren't as polished as they seemed. Rising maintenance costs. A lawsuit over a zoning dispute. 2 board members in disagreement over a future merger with another luxury venue. All of it tucked behind smiles and afternoon martinis. But Elijah saw it. And he waited. Until the moment was right. It happened on a Monday morning in April, when the sky was overcast and the club's boardroom was half empty. A quiet transaction. A name no one recognized on the paperwork. And just like that, the deed to Briar Ridge Country Club changed hands. The staff didn't notice. Not at first. Not until the following Saturday, when the new owner requested a visit for a private inspection, and when Elijah Brooks stepped out of the Lexus, same faded paint, same briefcase. This time, no one stopped him at the gate. But that story, that walk, that reckoning, it comes later. For now, what matters is this. They tried to keep him out, not knowing he was already planning to own the whole building. Because dignity, like faith, grows quiet and deep. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits, and sometimes it comes back with the deed. The news didn't make headlines. It never does when a man's dignity is bruised without a sound. Elijah Brooks didn't tell anyone about the country club. Not his staff, not his friends, not even his daughter. But something in the way he moved those next few weeks changed. Like a man who'd walked face first into a closed door and now studied every hallway he entered. He was quieter, sharper, watching more than speaking, like he'd been reminded of a lesson he never wanted to learn again. Back at the office, Elijah poured himself into work. His team was preparing a major pitch for a citywide government contract, one that would take his modest data firm and place it on the same field as national players. Every night, while the others went home, Elijah stayed behind. Rereading specs, tweaking code, making sure every comma in their proposal was right. Not because he had something to prove, but because he knew that they thought he did. Outside the office, the world kept reminding him where he stood. A new client mistook him for the janitor. A delivery driver handed paperwork to his junior associate instead. And at a tech networking event, someone asked, "So, what do you do for Elijah?" He smiled. "I am Elijah." The man blinked, chuckled nervously, then muttered something about mistaken identity that IT never ended. But Elijah never lost his grace. He'd been forged in it. Years ago, he'd stood in a hospital hallway as doctors told him his wife wouldn't be coming home. A brain aneurysm. Sudden. Final. Maya had just turned 6. He remembered holding her tiny backpack in one hand and a box of funeral papers in the other. And somehow, he still found the strength to pack her lunch that night. Life didn't owe Elijah anything. He'd accepted that. What hurt was how the world still acted like he had to earn his place in rooms he'd already paid the dues for. One Thursday morning, as he walked Maya to school, she reached up and touched the worry lines near his mouth. "Did something bad happen again, Daddy?" "No, baby," he said. "Just something I won't let happen twice." He kissed her goodbye and watched her disappear into a sea of backpacks and morning chatter. Then he turned toward the courthouse. He wasn't there for legal trouble. He was there for research. You see, when Elijah started asking about the country club, he didn't stop at ownership records. He asked about taxes, legal history, maintenance codes, licensing. And the more he found, the more cracks began to show. A missed tax filing. A zoning appeal still pending. A contractor lawsuit for unpaid work on the back 9 of the golf course. It wasn't about revenge. It was about seeing the structure for what it really was. Hollow behind the columns, he began connecting with city officials. Quietly. Respectfully. asked what it would take to redevelop a portion of that land into a mixed-use business and innovation hub. Hypothetically, he said, but they saw something in his eyes. Something determined. Back at work, his staff started to notice subtle shifts. Elijah hired 2 more interns, both from underserved neighborhoods. He began investing in local coding boot camps. And one night, after the interns had left, Elijah pulled out a folder labeled Briar Ridge Holdings LLC and stared at the documents inside. He still hadn't said a word about what he was planning, because Elijah didn't announce things. He just moved. And when you move in silence long enough, the noise takes care of itself. But fate wasn't done testing him. It happened at a coffee shop. Saturday morning. A casual stop with Maya before her violin lesson. The line was long, the baristas overwhelmed. A woman in a tennis skirt bumped into Elijah and immediately snapped, "Could you move?" She looked him up and down, then looked away just as quickly. Elijah didn't respond, just stepped aside. Then the man behind her said, "That's him." The woman turned. "Him who?" "Elijah Brooks. He's the tech guy I told you about. He's the one behind the Montgomery data project." She blinked, confused, and for a moment, she hesitated, as if realizing she might have just dismissed someone she should have recognized. But Elijah wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Maya, who'd just seen the whole thing. He bent down, tied her shoe, and whispered, "What matters isn't what people call you. It's what you build while they're calling you names." That night, he sat alone on the porch of their small home. No music, just crickets and the hum of passing cars. In his lap was a letter. Not mailed, not signed, just folded once, perfectly. It was from his mother, one she'd written before she passed. A letter he rarely opened. Tonight, he did. "Son, they will doubt you because they fear you. Not for what you are, but for what you might become if they ever let go of the leash. Don't waste your time tugging at their chains. Build a new road, one they'll have to walk to find you." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. The next morning, Elijah met with a venture partner who'd quietly expressed interest in legacy properties with hidden redevelopment potential. Elijah had done his homework, and now, the time had come to move. Over the next month, Elijah's lawyers made an offer through a front-facing LLC. It was not flashy, but it was clean, fast, and funded. The club's board, under financial strain and internal conflict, accepted. The press never got wind. Not yet. And on a quiet morning, with dew still clinging to the golf carts and groundskeepers unaware of the shift, Elijah Brooks became the legal owner of Briar Ridge Country Club. Not a guest. Not a charity case. The owner. But even then, he didn't rush in with cameras. He didn't call the people who'd turned him away. He didn't announce it on LinkedIn. He waited. Because Elijah believed that true power wasn't loud. It simply arrived. And when it did, it rewrote everything. The invitation came folded neatly inside a white envelope with embossed lettering. Annual Briar Ridge Members Gala, hosted on club grounds. Elijah stared at it for a long time. It was addressed to the property owner. Not a name, not a title, just a position, but it was enough. He hadn't been back since the day he was turned away. That memory had never dulled. Not with time, not with the deed now sitting in his office drawer. It still stung, not because of what they did, but because of how easily they did it. The way no one questioned the decision. The way silence had partnered with exclusion. And now, the same gate that had been shut in his face would open for him. Automatically, he tucked the invitation in his coat pocket, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. Elijah had never wanted to be the man who boasted, who returned with fanfare. He wanted to earn his space quietly and make the room better without needing to tell anyone it was his to begin with. But life doesn't always wait on grace. 2 days later, he received a letter from the school district that it was about Maya, but a reassignment. Their school was closing the gifted program due to lack of sustainable funding. Maya's scholarship would be revoked. She would be moved to a school across town where academic resources were limited, and the message was clear: she'll adapt. Elijah stared at the letter in disbelief. He called the board. He asked questions. He offered to donate. He got silence. And then he realized some systems weren't broken. They were working exactly as intended. That night, as Maya slept with her violin tucked beside her pillow, Elijah stood in the kitchen with both hands braced against the sink. The streetlight outside flickered. He hadn't felt this powerless since the day he held her alone in the hospital, promising her mother that he'd do right by their girl. He couldn't let this go. The next morning, Elijah drove to the district office. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. But he was firm. "I'm not asking for favors," he said. "I'm asking for fairness. And if this is the way you treat bright children just because they don't fit your template of success, then I'm not done talking." But they were. The door closed before he reached the last word. Back home, Elijah sat in the dark for a long time. No TV, no music, just the sound of his breathing, and a low burn in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about the country club anymore. It was about every gate, every door, every table where people like him were only allowed to serve, not to sit. He opened his laptop and pulled up the redevelopment plan he'd started drafting months ago. At first, it had been theoretical, but now it became something else entirely. A blueprint for reclamation. He began working through the night, revising zoning proposals, contacting architects, drafting pitch decks. By dawn, he had a full schematic prepared, an innovation hub, a youth mentorship program, a tech accelerator designed for underserved communities. And all of it, right on the land once reserved for exclusivity. The golf course? Gone. The clubhouse ballroom? Reimagined as a startup incubator. The private lounges? A co-working space for women and minority entrepreneurs. Elijah didn't just want the property. He wanted to rewire its very purpose. But before any of that, he had one more thing to do. He returned to Briar Ridge. Alone. No cameras. No lawyer. Just himself, and a memory that he stepped out of the Lexus, same as before. The valet was new, young, nervous. Elijah smiled softly. "I'm here to inspect the property," he said. The young man's eyes widened when he realized who he was talking to. "Why, yes, sir," he stammered. "Of course. Can I take your keys?" Elijah handed them over without a word and walked toward the entrance, the same white columns, the same polished marble floors. But something felt different this time. It wasn't the building that had changed. It was him. He walked slowly through the lobby, past portraits of founders, past the reception desk where the concierge once smirked. That man wasn't working today. Or maybe he was no longer working here at all. In the main dining room, a few older members glanced up, not recognizing him, but instinctively scanning his presence. It was the same look as before. Appraisal, doubt, distance. But Elijah didn't stop. He stepped up to the manager's office and knocked once. Inside was a man named James Withers, longtime manager, well-respected by members, always impeccably dressed. He looked up from his desk. "May I help?" Then his face froze. "Elijah Brooks," he said slowly. "We weren't expecting you." "I know. You're here to tour the property?" "No," Elijah said. "I'm here to introduce myself." Withers blinked. "I'm the new owner." Silence stretched. Then Withers stood, stiffly. "I see. That's quite a development." Elijah nodded. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with your leadership staff. Not today, not next week, but soon. We have some changes to discuss." "Of course." "And James." "Yes. There won't be a valet issue next time, will there?" Withers flushed. "No, certainly not." Elijah turned and walked away, calm, upright, unapologetic. He didn't need revenge. He was building something stronger. But before he made anything public, he needed to do something for himself. He drove home, pulled Maya's school folder from her bag. He made 3 phone calls, called in a favor with an investor he'd once mentored. That same investor had a seat on a private charter school board. Within 3 days, Maya had a scholarship, full tuition, transfer accepted. On the morning of her first day, Maya stood at the gate of the new campus, violin case in one hand, curls tied back in a blue ribbon. She looked up at him and said, "You look happier, Daddy." "I feel lighter," he said. He watched her walk through the gates of a school that saw her worth, and he promised himself, one day, he'd make sure that gate stayed open for every child who came after her. Back at the club, the board was preparing for the gala. They still didn't know. Not really. Rumors had started about new ownership, about changes, but no names had been released. No press statements. Just the word transition whispered over cocktails. And that's how Elijah liked it, because the most powerful truth is the one people never see coming. And he was about to show them what quiet power looks like when it finally speaks. A month passed. The gala faded into memory for most of the members, tucked away between real estate deals and social events. But for Elijah Brooks, it marked the beginning of something much larger than a speech. Each morning he woke up before the sun and walked the perimeter of the property alone, not as an act of routine, but as a form of remembrance. Every corner of Briar Ridge held echoes of exclusion, and now it would be reshaped into a space that welcomed those like him. People whose excellence had always been hidden behind someone else's assumptions. The golf course was the first to go. Contractors arrived early one Friday, tearing up the carefully curated landscape with excavators and utility trucks. Some of the older members watched from a distance, horrified that their private oasis was being disturbed, but Elijah didn't flinch. Where others saw luxury being stripped away, he saw barriers being removed. In their place would rise a sleek co-working hub, a glass-walled innovation space, classrooms, and mentorship offices, all designed for young minds who had never stepped foot on a golf green, let alone dreamed of owning the land under it. Inside the old ballroom, the echo of jazz was replaced with the quiet tapping of keyboards and laughter from teenagers learning how to code. Elijah watched them from the mezzanine one morning, his coffee cooling in his hand as a young black girl explained machine learning to her classmates like it was second nature. He smiled, not because he was proud of himself, but because she didn't know she was standing in a place that once would have turned her away at the door. Across town, Maya had settled into her new school beautifully. Her violin teacher said she had a rare ear and even rarer discipline. Every evening, she played in the living room while Elijah typed out emails and reviewed building plans. It became their new rhythm. Between the music and the hum of purpose, the house felt fuller than it had in years. People began to reach out. Some were sincere, young entrepreneurs seeking guidance, local teachers asking how their students could be involved, community organizers offering support. Others were not. A few former board members tried to regain influence. They sent polite letters, suggested brunches. One even offered to help Elijah manage expectations about the kind of people who'd now be visiting the club. Elijah read those letters once and filed them away, unanswered. He had no interest in re-establishing the old hierarchy under new language. The community was already watching. They saw the headlines. They saw the photos. And more importantly, they saw the doors staying open. One morning, a mother stopped Elijah outside the gates. She didn't give her name, just said thank you and held his hand for a moment longer than expected before walking away. Inside, things kept growing. A nonprofit for first-gen college applicants moved into one wing. A startup building educational apps for kids with learning differences set up shop in another. On weekends, Maya and Elijah volunteered at the coding boot camp. She helped with snacks and organizing supplies, and sometimes sat in the back and practiced violin during breaks. He never asked her to come. She just did. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the high windows of the former dining room now turned into a mentoring space, Elijah paused to look at an old portrait of the club's founders still hanging near the stairwell. He thought about taking it down. Then he decided to leave it up, not to honor them, but to show how far the room had come. That winter, Elijah received a letter. It was from one of the men who had voted against him joining the club in the first place. The letter was handwritten. It apologized not with excuses, but with humility. It ended with a line that struck Elijah harder than he expected. I realize now that I spent decades protecting a space that didn't need protection. It needed purpose. Elijah folded the letter and placed it in a drawer next to his mother's. He didn't need closure, but he welcomed growth. One Friday evening, Maya performed in her school's winter recital. Elijah sat in the front row, suit pressed, phone turned off. When she finished, the room rose to their feet and Elijah stood the slowest, not because he wasn't proud, but because he needed a moment to hold the emotion before it rushed out. After the applause died down and the crowd filtered out, Maya walked over and handed him a program. She had circled her name and written next to it in pencil, "For Daddy. You didn't just open doors. You built new ones." Later that night, Elijah stood in the middle of the old main hall of Briar Ridge. It was quiet, empty, but full. The floors had been redone, the chandelier replaced with a skylight. He could see the stars. He closed his eyes and breathed in the newness, not just of the building, but of everything that came with believing that dignity was not a performance. It was a path, and he had walked it long before anyone saw it beneath his feet. The spring air was soft that morning, and the sky was the color of calm. Elijah sat alone on a weathered bench just outside the building that once bore signs warning non-members to check in at the gate. Now there were no signs, no guards, Just a quiet path lined with tulips leading up to wide glass doors etched with a single inscription, "Welcome." He watched as a small group of teenagers crossed the courtyard laughing, notebooks in hand, one of them holding a camera, the other waving a tablet. They didn't glance up at him, and that was what made him smile. To them, he wasn't a myth or a headline. He was just the man who built the place they now had the right to walk through. Later that afternoon, he walked the halls slowly. It wasn't nostalgia he felt. It was something deeper, a quiet thankfulness, the kind that hums beneath your skin when you know you didn't give up on yourself even when the world tried to convince you to. He stepped into a room where three young founders were pitching ideas to a mentor. One of them looked up and gave him a nod. Elijah nodded back and kept walking. He had long since stopped needing recognition to feel seen. That weekend, Maya surprised him. She came home from school with a copy of the local magazine. On the cover was a photo taken from behind. Elijah sitting in the newly designed atrium, sunlight on his shoulders, a line of young people streaming past. The headline read, "The man who opened every door without needing to slam one shut." He laughed softly and shook his head. Then he framed it and hung it not in his office, but in the hallway near the guest entrance. The place where visitors would see it only if they wandered beyond the main rooms. That was enough. One warm Sunday, Elijah hosted an open house. There was no RSVP list, no dress code, just music playing softly in the background and lemonade served in glass jars. The families came first, then the students, then the curious neighbors who once avoided even driving past Briar Ridge. A little boy tugged at his sleeve and asked if he could be an inventor too. Elijah knelt down, looked him in the eye, and said, "You already are. You just haven't built it yet." Near dusk, Elijah stepped outside. The sun was setting low over the horizon, casting long gold shadows across the lawn. Maya joined him, leaning her head on his shoulder, and for a long while they said nothing. They didn't need to. Behind them, laughter echoed from inside the walls that once held only whispers of privilege. Now it held potential, not polished, not perfect, but real, earned. The next morning, Elijah wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just a note for whoever would take over one day. It read, "If you are reading this, remember what this place was built on. Not concrete, not capital, but on a single idea, that the worth of a person cannot be measured by where they come from or how they dress or whether someone else believes they belong. It can only be known by what they carry quietly. Keep the doors open, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." He folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer in the main office. No plaque, no announcement, just a page in a quiet drawer waiting for someone to find it when they needed it most. That evening he sat under the oak tree near the west wing where the kids now held debate club. The sky above turned indigo. A young woman walked past, paused, and turned back. "I heard about you," she said. "Thank you." Elijah just nodded and smiled. The light caught the edge of his glasses, and for a second, he looked like a man who had never once been turned away from anything. But he had, and that was the miracle. Not that he overcame it, but that he never let it make him bitter. And when the last light flickered out across the lawn and the quiet came, he closed his eyes and breathed deep, not like a man ending something, but like someone who had just finished building a bridge across a river no one thought could be crossed. And somewhere in the quiet, in a place beyond applause or headlines, the world took a breath with him. Thank you for watching Cracks of Light. If this story moved you, inspired you, reminded you of the dignity we all carry even when the world pretends not to see it, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who may need to hear it. We're building something here, one story at a time. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response is to simply walk back into the room they once said you didn't belong in, holding the keys.